The Paraguayan War, also known as the War of the Triple Alliance and the Great War in Paraguay, was a South American war fought from 1864 to 1870 between Paraguay and the Triple Alliance of Argentina, the Empire of Brazil, and Uruguay. With an estimated 400,000 deaths, the war was the deadliest and bloodiest in Latin America's history. It particularly devastated Paraguay, which suffered catastrophic losses in population. Almost 70% of its adult male population died, according to some counts, and was forced to cede territory to Argentina and Brazil. According to some estimates, Paraguay's pre-war population of 525,000 was reduced to 221,000, of which only 28,000 were men. The war began in late 1864 as a result of the conflict between Paraguay and Brazil caused by the Uruguayan War. Argentina and Uruguay entered the war against Paraguay in 1865, and it then became known as the War of the Triple Alliance. War ended with the total defeat of Paraguay. After it lost in conventional warfare, Paraguay conducted a drawn-out guerrilla resistance, a disaster that resulted in the further destruction of the Paraguayan military and much of the civilian population through battle casualties, hunger and diseases. The guerrilla war lasted 14 months until President Francisco Solano Lopez was killed in action by Brazilian forces in Battle of Cerro Cora on March 1, 1870. Argentine and Brazilian troops occupied Paraguay until 1876. Estimates of total Paraguayan losses range from 21,000 to 1,200,000 people. It took decades for Paraguay to recover from the chaos and demographic losses. Political situation before the war. There are several theories regarding the origins of the war. The traditional view emphasizes the policies of Paraguayan President Francisco Solano Lopez, who used Uruguayan War as a pretext to gain control of the Platen Basin and caused the inevitable response from the regional hegemons Brazil and Argentina, who wanted to dominate much smaller republics of Uruguay and Paraguay. The war has also been attributed to the after-effects of colonialism in South America, with border conflicts between the new states, the struggle for power among neighboring nations over the strategic Rio de la Plata region, Brazilian and Argentine meddling in internal Uruguayan politics which had already caused the Platen War, Solano Lopez's efforts to help his allies in Uruguay, as well as his presumed expansionist ambitions. Before the war, Paraguay had experienced rapid economic and military growth. A strong military was a necessity since Paraguay's larger neighbors Argentina and Brazil had territorial claims against it and wanted to dominate it. Politically, much like they did Uruguay, Paraguay had recurring boundary disputes and tariff issues with Argentina and Brazil for many years during the rule of Carlos Antonio Lopez. Regional tension. Since Brazil and Argentina had become independent, the struggle for hegemony in the Rio de la Plata profoundly marked the diplomatic and political relations among the countries of the region. Brazil was the first country to recognize the independence of Paraguay in 1844. At this time, Argentina still considered it a breakaway province, while Argentina was ruled by Juan Manuel Rosas, a common enemy of both Brazil and Paraguay. Brazil contributed to the improvement of the fortifications and development of the Paraguayan army, sending officials and technical help to Asunción. As no roads linked the inland province of Mato Grosso to Rio de Janeiro, Brazilian ships needed to travel through Paraguayan territory, going up the Paraguay River to arrive at Cuiabá. However, Brazil had difficulty obtaining permission from the government in Asunción to freely use Paraguay River for its shipping needs. Uruguayan Prelude. Brazil had carried out 3 political and military interventions in the politically unstable Uruguay. In 1851 against Manuel Uribe in order to fight Argentine influence in the country and to end the Great Siege of Montevideo. In 1855, at the request of the Uruguayan government and Venancio Flores, leader of the Colorado Party, who were traditionally supported by the Brazilian Empire, and in 1864, against the Atanasio Aguirre. This last intervention would lead to the Paraguayan War. On April 19, 1863, Uruguayan General Venancio Flores, who was then an officer in the Argentine army and the leader of the Colorado Party of Uruguay, invaded his country, starting the Cruzada Libertadora with open support of Argentina, which supplied rebels with arms, ammunition, and 2,000 men. Flores wanted to overthrow the Blanco Party government of President Bernardo Berro, which was allied with Paraguay. Paraguayan President López sent a note on 6 September, 1863 to the Argentine government asking for an explanation, but Buenos Aires denied any involvement in Uruguay. For that moment, mandatory military service was introduced in Paraguay, and in February 1864, additional 64,000 men were drafted into the army. 1 year after the beginning of the Cruzada Libertadora, in April 1864, Brazilian minister José Antonio Saraiva arrived in Uruguayan waters with the imperial fleet, to demand payment for damages caused to gaucho farmers in border conflicts with Uruguayan farmers. Uruguayan President Atanasio Aguirre from the Blanco Party rejected the Brazilian demands, presented his own demands and asked Paraguay for help. To settle the growing crisis, Solano López offered himself as mediator of the Uruguayan crisis, as he was a political and diplomatic ally of the Uruguayan Blancos, but the offer was turned down by Brazil. Brazilian soldiers on the northern borders of Uruguay started to provide help to Flores' troops, harassed Uruguayan officers, while the imperial fleet pressed hard on Montevideo. During the months of June-August 1864, a cooperation treaty was signed between Brazil and Argentina at Buenos Aires, for mutual assistance in the Plate Basin crisis. Brazilian Minister Saraiva on August 4, 1864, sent an ultimatum to the Uruguayan government: either comply with the Brazilian demands, or the Brazilian army would retaliate. The Paraguayan government was informed of all this and sent to Brazil another ultimatum, which stated in part, "The government of the Republic of Paraguay will consider any occupation of the Oriental Territory as an attempt against the equilibrium of the States of the Plate, which interests the Republic of Paraguay as a guarantee for its security, peace, and prosperity, and that it protests in the most solemn manner against the act, freeing itself for the future of every responsibility that may arise from the present declaration." The Brazilian government, probably believing that the Paraguayan threat would be only diplomatic, answered in September 1, 1864, stating that they will never abandon the duty of protecting the lives and interests of Brazilian subjects. But in its answer 2 days later, Paraguayan government insisted that, if Brazil takes the measures protested against in the note of August 30, 1864, Paraguay will be under the painful necessity of making its protest effective. Despite the Paraguayan notes and ultimatums, on October 12, 1864, Brazilian troops under the command of Gen. João Propicio Mena Barreto invaded Uruguay, thus marking the beginning of the hostilities. On the 12th of November 1864, 1864, the Paraguayan ship Tacuari captured the Brazilian ship Marques de Olinda, which had sailed up the Paraguay River to the province of Mato Grosso. News of the war's end was brought by Pereira Pinto and met with joy in Rio de Janeiro. Brazilian Emperor Dom Pedro II found himself waylaid by a crowd of thousands in the streets amid acclamations. But public opinion quickly changed for the worse when newspapers began running stories painting the convention of the 20th of February as harmful to Brazilian interests, for which the cabinet was blamed. The newly raised Viscount of Tamandaré and Mena Barreto had supported the peace accord. Tamandaré changed his mind soon afterward and played along with the allegations. A member of the opposition party, Paraguay, was used as a scapegoat by the emperor and the government and was recalled in disgrace to the imperial capital. The accusation that the convention had failed to meet Brazilian interests proved to be unfounded. Not only had Paraguay managed to settle all Brazilian claims, but by preventing the death of thousands, he gained a willing and grateful Uruguayan ally instead of a dubious and resentful one, which provided Brazil with an important base of operations during the acute clash with Paraguay that shortly ensued. Opposing forces. Paraguay. According to some historians, Paraguay began the war with over 60,000 well-trained men, 38,000 of whom were already under arms, 400 cannons, a naval squadron of 23 steamboats and 5 river-navigating ships. Communications in the Rio de la Plata basin were maintained solely by river as very few roads existed. Whoever controlled the rivers would win the war, so Paraguay had built fortifications on the banks of the lower end of the Paraguay River. However, recent studies suggest many problems. Although the Paraguayan army had between 70,000 and 100,000 men at the beginning of the conflict, they were badly equipped. Most infantry armaments consisted of inaccurate smoothbore muskets and carbines, slow to reload and short-ranged. The artillery was similarly poor. Military officers had no training or experience, and there was no command system, as all decisions were made personally by Lopez. Food, ammunition and armaments were scarce, with logistics and hospital care deficient and non-existent. The nation of about 450,000 people could not stand against the Triple Alliance of 11 million people. Brazil and its allies. At the beginning of the war, the military forces of Brazil, Argentina and Uruguay were far smaller than Paraguay's. Argentina had approximately 8,500 regular troops and a naval squadron of 4 Vários and 1 Goleta. Uruguay entered the war with fewer than 2,000 men and no navy. Many of Brazil's 16,000 troops were located in its southern garrisons. The Brazilian advantage, though, was in its navy, comprising 45 ships with 239 cannons and about 4,000 well-trained crew. A great part of the squadron was already in the Rio de la Plata basin, where it had acted under the Marquis of Tamandaré in the intervention against Aguirre government. Brazil, however, was unprepared to fight a war. Its army was disorganized. The troops it used in Uruguay were mostly armed contingents of gauchos and National Guard, while some Brazilian accounts of the war described their infantry as volunteers. Other Argentinian revisionist and Paraguayan accounts disparaged the Brazilian infantry as mainly recruited from slaves and the landless underclass, who were promised free land for enlisting. The cavalry was formed from the National Guard of Rio Grande do Sul. The war begins. Paraguayan offensive in Mato Grosso. Paraguay took the initiative during the first phase of the war, launched Mato Grosso campaign by invading Brazilian province Mato Grosso on 14 December 1864, followed by invasion in Rio Grande do Sul province in the south in early 1865 and the Argentine Corrientes province. Two separate Paraguayan forces invaded Mato Grosso simultaneously. An expedition of 3,248 troops, commanded by Col. Vicente Vários, was transported by a naval squadron under the command of Capitán de Fragata Pedro Ignacio Meza up the Paraguay River to the town of Concepcion. They attacked the Nova Coimbra fort on 27 December 1864. The Brazilian garrison of 154 men resisted for 3 days, under the command of Lt. Colonel Hermenegildo de Albuquerque Porto Carrero. When the munitions were exhausted, the defenders abandoned the fort and withdrew up the river towards Corumbá on board the gunship Anhambay. After occupying the fort, the Paraguayans advanced further north, taking the cities of Albuquerque, Tage and Corumbá in January 1865. Solano Lopez then sent a detachment to attack the military frontier post of Dourados. This detachment, led by Martin Urbieta, encountered tough resistance on 29 December 1864 from Lt. Antonio João Ribeiro and his 16 men, who were all eventually killed. The Paraguayans continued to near Huacan Miranda, defeating the troops of Col. José Diaz da Silva. Coxum was taken in April 1865. The second Paraguayan column, formed from some of the 4,650 men led by Col. Francisco Isidoro Resquan at Concepcion, penetrated into Mato Grosso with 1,500 troops. Despite these victories, the Paraguayan forces did not continue to Cuiabá, the capital of the province, where Augusto Levija had fortified the camp of Melgaco. The main objective was the capture of the gold and diamond mines, disrupting the flow of these materials into Brazil until 1869. Brazil sent an expedition to fight the invaders in Mato Grosso. A column of 2,780 men led by Col. Manuel Pedro Drago left Uberaba in Minas Gerais in April 1865 and arrived at Coxum in December after a difficult march of more than 2,000 kilometers through 4 provinces. However, Paraguay had already abandoned Coxum by December. Drago arrived at Miranda in September 1866, and Paraguayans had left once again. In January 1867, Col. Carlos de Moraes Camisao assumed command of the column, now with only 1,680 men, and decided to invade Paraguayan territory, which he penetrated as far as Laguna, where Paraguayan cavalry forced the expedition to retreat. Despite the efforts of Camisao's troops and the resistance in the region, which succeeded in liberating Corumbá in June 1867, Mato Grosso remained under Paraguayan control. The Brazilians withdrew from the area in April 1868, moving the troops to the main theater of operations in the south of Paraguay. Paraguayan invasion of Corrientes and Rio Grande do Sul. When the war first broke out between Paraguay and Brazil, Argentina had stayed neutral. Solano Lopez doubted Argentina's neutrality, because it gave Brazilian ships permission to navigate in the Argentine rivers of the Plate region. Despite Paraguay being at war with Brazil, the invasion of Corrientes and Rio Grande do Sul provinces was the second phase of the Paraguayan offensive. In order to support the Uruguayan Blancos, the Paraguayans had to travel across Argentine territory. In January 1865, Solano Lopez asked Argentina's permission for an army of 20,000 men began to travel through the province of Corrientes. Argentine President Bartolomé Mitre refused Paraguay's request and a similar one from Brazil. After this refusal, Paraguayan Congress gathered at an emergency meeting on March 5, 1865. After several days of discussions, on March 23 the Congress decided to declare war on Argentina for its policies hostile to Paraguay and favorable to Brazil, and then they conferred to Francisco Solano López Carrillo the rank of Field Marshal of the Republic of Paraguay. The declaration of war was sent on March 29, 1864 to Buenos Aires, following the invasion of the Corrientes province by Paraguay on 13 April 1865. A great uproar stirred in Buenos Aires as the public learned of Paraguay's declaration of war. In May 4, 1865, President Bartolomé Mitre made a famous speech to the crowds. "My fellow countrymen, I promise you, in 3 days we shall be at the barracks, in 3 weeks at the frontiers, and in 3 months in Asunción." The same day Argentina declared war on Paraguay, but days before that, on the 1st of May 1865, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay had signed the secret treaty of the Triple Alliance in Buenos Aires. They named Bartolomé Mitre, President of Argentina, as Supreme Commander of the Allied forces. The signatories of the treaty were Rufino de Elizalde, Octaviano de Almeida and Carlos de Castro. The treaty states that Paraguay is to be blamed on all the consequences of the conflict and has to pay all the debt of war. Paraguay has to remain without any fortress and military force. Large portions of Paraguayan territories were to be taken by Argentina and Brazil at the end of the conflict, and the independence of Paraguay was supposed to be respected only for 5 years. The treaty sparkled international outrage and voices favorable to Paraguay. On the 13th of April 1865, a Paraguayan squadron sailed down the Parana River and attacked 2 Argentine ships in the port of Corrientes. Immediately Gen. Robles troops took the city with 3,000 men, and a cavalry force of 800 arrived the same day. Leaving a force of 1,500 men in the city, Robles advanced southwards along the eastern bank. Along with Robles troops, a force of 12,000 soldiers under Col. Antonio de la Cruz Estegreba crossed the Argentine border south of Encarnacion in May 1865, driving for Rio Grande do Sul. They traveled down Uruguay River and took the town of Sao Borja on June 12. Uruguay to the south was taken on 6 August with little resistance. By invading Corrientes, Solano López had hoped to gain the support of the powerful Argentine caudillo Justo José de Urquiza, governor of the provinces of Corrientes and Entre Rios, who was known to be the chief federalist hostile to Mitre and the central government in Buenos Aires. However, Urquiza gave his full support to an Argentine offensive. The forces advanced approximately 200 kilometers south before ultimately ending the offensive in failure. On June 11, 1865, the naval battle of Riachuelo, the Brazilian fleet commanded by Admiral Francisco Manuel Barroso da Silva, destroyed the powerful Paraguayan navy and prevented the Paraguayans from permanently occupying Argentine territory. For all practical purposes, this battle decided the outcome of the war in favor of the Triple Alliance. From that point on, it controlled the waters of the Rio de la Plata basin up to the entrance to Paraguay. A separate Paraguayan division of 3,200 men that continued towards Uruguay under the command of Marj. Pedro Duarte was defeated by Allied troops under Venancio Flores in the bloody Battle of Ute on the banks of the Uruguay River near Paso de los Libres. Siege of Uruguay, while Solano López ordered the retreat of the forces that had occupied Corrientes. The Paraguayan troops that invaded Sao Borja advanced, taking Itaquí and Uruguay. The situation in Rio Grande do Sul was chaotic, and the local Brazilian military commanders were incapable of mounting effective resistance to the Paraguayans. The Baron of Porto Alegre set out for Uruguay, a small town in the province's west, where the Paraguayan army was besieged by a combined force of Brazilian, Argentine and Uruguayan units. Porto Alegre assumed the command of the Brazilian army in Uruguay on the 21st of August 1865. On the 18th of September, the Paraguayan garrison surrendered without further bloodshed.